So I feel like I have the privilege of growing up in an era where I was still able to play games from PlayStation, PlayStation 2, and even earlier than that, as well as appreciate the newer IPs and newer technology of like the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360. So now I feel like I'm in a very unique position where I know and I can play games from older consoles as well as games from current gen consoles and then forth. I don't think I really get hung up on the past as much, but I also have like a nostalgia for a lot of these older games. I understand this isn't everybody, and a lot of games have outdated themselves, and I realize for a lot of people it's harder for them to go back to certain games. In recent memories, we started to see like the SNES, the Sega Genesis style of games, those like 16-bit style of games that I feel like are becoming more popular again. It's becoming more normal for like current like people who weren't really born in that era to really play those games. But a retro era that I feel like is really hard to get into is the early 3D. So like N64, PlayStation 1 specifically are the hardest for people to get into. So with like Twisted Metal the show coming out and like Twisted Metal coming onto like the PlayStation subscription plus tier whatever, I decided that I really wanted to play Twisted Metal. This is a game I grew up playing tons of. More so Twisted Metal on the PlayStation 2, so like Twisted Metal Black. But I also remember playing Twisted Metal 2 and having a blast with it. Me and my brothers would get together and wreak havoc and just have a blast playing this game. So I figured, hey, I want to show my wife this game. Maybe this is something that we can get into together. And it didn't really work out that way. You gotta find me. And you'll see little pickups. That's like different weapons.
Hold on, it's going too fast. I can't do anything. What's happening? Wait, hold on. There's some weird shit going on.
Okay, where are you?
Restarted. My controller's messing up.
Let go of the stick. How is it messing up?
I don't know, it's just driving all crazy.
It drives terrible? Oh. Yeah, so I remember when I used to play this with my brothers, we never really noticed how terrible the controls are, how terrible the graphics are. And that's one thing that, like, obviously we know this as time goes further and we get further away from this specific era of gaming, it gets harder to go back to. And it's something that, like, I knew applies to games, but I'm starting to realize it more and more how there's just some gamers who are never going to be able to play certain games that a lot of people hold so dear to their heart and consider like the peaks of gaming. So I think when we look back at a lot of games, we got to start to remember that we have a certain like bias, nostalgia towards some of these games because one, either we're really used to how they control so there's no issue to it, or we get shrouded in nostalgia so it does not bother us as much. So a lot of times when I say that like sometimes current gen games are better than games in the past, a lot of people get really upset by that because they're like, no, because these games paved the way and these games did this and iconic and blah blah blah. 100% get that, 100% respect that. You also got to come to the understanding that yes, these games were groundbreaking and paved the way for gaming as it is now, but it's just so hard to go back to, and they were so remedial a lot of the times that it's hard to compare some retro style games to some of the modern era games. We've learned our lessons, we've implemented better tactics, better gameplay controls, etc., etc. So I feel like a lot of these things, like sometimes when people look back at games in the past, we always consider like, okay, like graphically it's not great, but the game is just a great game if you can look past the graphics. Well, something that a lot of us, like, again, fail to realize is that other people cannot mechanically control these games to the point of enjoyment. I mean, sure, they can dabble in it and maybe get good at it if they really wanted to, but there's very little reason for them to say, okay, let me not play the most current up-to-gen game that I really want to play and instead go back and play, like, Twisted Metal 2 on PlayStation. It's a hard sell for a lot of current gamers, a lot of people who didn't grow up in these eras. And yeah, that kind of sucks. But at the same time, I feel like it's just the way that this medium works because it's so embedded with technology, because a lot of it happens to be what makes sense for that time. A lot of times developers don't future proof their games, or specifically at that era, it was hard for them to future proof the games because they didn't know what the next 5-10 years of gaming was going to look like. When Twisted Metal 2 came out on the PlayStation 1, I don't believe the PlayStation at the time had a right analog stick. I believe it was still just the one analog stick. So there wasn't the way of like controlling the camera as well as controlling the character. It was just all like latched onto one stick. So again, it's just one of those things that I feel like going back to a lot of these games in the past, no, they did not age well, and that sucks. I really wish that there was better ways to kind of like bring these games back, or that a lot of developers would find ways to like clean these games up. I think that's why it's so important that we have things like remasters, why it's so important that we have, you know, remakes, or not just ports. Like ports and emulation can only take us so far, but I think when we start talking about the preservation of gaming, I think we got to start to also understand that it's not enough just to preserve the original state of the game. That's only important for some people, but if we don't want these specific IPs, these specific games to just die and be left to time, I feel like it's very important that we modernize it and make it playable by a current generation gamer, and we also kind of find ways to future proof these games in ways like remakes or remasters or whatever it could be, but just making sure that we find a way to preserve these games in a way that these games deserve, because I love Twisted Metal. And it sucks that I know people who've never played Twisted Metal. There's a lot of people who'll never respect Twisted Metal because there's no current gen game of that. The last game of Twisted Metal was back on the PlayStation 3. And even though I had fun with it, a lot of people did not. So a lot of people aren't gonna tell people go play Twisted Metal. Most likely you're gonna tell people to go play Twisted Metal Black or Twisted Metal 2. And currently right now, Twisted Metal 2 is the most accessible, being at how it's on the PlayStation Plus whatever tier. So I mean, that sucks. I guess the only thing I could take away is just remember that a lot of these games, even though you might recommend it to someone who should play it, maybe you might say, or when you get mad at someone who says that a current gen game is better than a past game, just remember that there is a level of, you know, time with some of these games. Sometimes it's just you have to have been there to experience it and understand why they're so important. But overall, a lot of these games just aren't future proofed for current gen games, and a lot of them just don't play well. They're very outdated. With all that being said, I guess the question is, does Twisted Metal 2 specifically hold up in 2023? I'll let my wife answer that question.
Really?
Yeah, look.
I like that for me.
Look, hold on. I don't know what the fuck's going on. Nothing makes sense.
It's just bad. Still a good game. I still like it.
I don't like this fucking game.
Oh, I like it. Do you like the idea of the game?
No.
Cars shooting each other?
Nah. I don't like the way that it moves. Everything is horrible.
Oh yeah, the controlling is bad, but the idea of the game.
I don't care about the idea of the game. I care that the controller sucks. Game's a bad game. It's one of your worst.
It's one of the worst ones I ever showed you.